It's 2026. People have very high expectations for the kinds of efficiencies that they will be able to unlock with generative AI. Content management systems like Contentful or Adobe Experience Manager, Drupal, many others are beginning to deploy translation as a feature options so that you can get your text instantly translated. And it's honestly pretty good. I mean, compared to what machine translation used to be, you can definitely get, at least in my opinion, better results with machine translation plus a large language model in the loop. That seems like a very appealing value proposition, right? If you pitch that to an executive, for instance, a marketing executive that's just looking at team and business efficiencies, first question that pops to mind, it's like, why do we even pay translators? Why do we need a translation management system to manage all of this? The question really comes down to two things: scalability and control. When you think about, let's say, as an example, processing translations within Contentful using translation as a feature, for instance, you're going to have quick results. It's going to be very simple because it's built into the software. It doesn't require third-party integrations and things like that. So that's great. And you're probably going to be able to localize your site fairly quickly into multiple languages. And that's amazing. And especially for small brands that are just looking for discoverability, that's something that's unprecedented. Actually, it's really, really cool. I can't stress enough how much it's awesome to be able to take a first step towards globalization in such an easy way, right? That's something that's really interesting, to perform a proof of concept, etc. What happens is that language, as it is in its source, or whether the text is authored in English or German or Japanese, Brazilian, Portuguese, whatever, language is something that's very alive. It's always changing. So what's going to happen is, let's say you're going to publish this first iteration of your website, and then maybe you're going to get a feedback from one of your customers in Brazil, and they're going to say, you know what, this sounds weird. Can you, and someone in your team is going to go ahead and change that to something more appropriate. And these kinds of requests and feedbacks, they're going to happen quite a bit, especially the bigger your site is, the more languages you work with, the more feedback you're going to get. This feedback is going to be incorporated in pages, but then how do you keep track of that? So what's going to happen is the next time you translate that page, the next time you update that page, how do you make sure that you only translated what really got updated? And how do you make sure that what gets updated takes into account that change, right? So let me exemplify. Let's say someone changes a word in that text and they say, you know what, this word for get started now is just too informal. We need something that's just a little bit more formal for our register, for our kind of customer or consumer in Brazil. That is not only going to be a change in that specific string, it's often a change that's going to impact the way you're translating in general, right? Especially with large language models. Any term, for instance, that gets added to a term base, it gets vectorized. And because it gets vectorized, that means that it carries impact in every single decision thereafter. So what happens when you're working with translation as a feature, you get the schism, right? You get the model on one end, and then you get the strings that are being translated on another end. And if you make changes to those strings, you're not necessarily impacting the model. And because they're just facilitating a very quick and easy application of the large language model, they're not thinking about the entire lifetime of the string and how it should sit within the entire linguistic corpus that you're creating. So let's compare that, right? If you're working with a translation management system like VeroWorks, what's going to happen is whatever change that gets made in that string, that's going to update automatically the translation memory, or let's say the library of all of your strings that you have for that website. It's also going to update, possibly, if you have learning terms turned on, it's going to update your keywords, your company brand core words, right? So the next time you reprocess content, that change will be taken into account, not only in that specific string itself, but it will be taken into account in the content as a whole. So if you're making a decision that's making the text more informal, suggestions are likely to become more informal in this architecture. So you begin to think about the nightmare that potentially version control could become, the nightmare that potentially voice tone control could become. Because these things, they don't happen in a vacuum, right? It's not just translate, publish, done. You start getting feedback loops. Possibly you're going to want to involve reviewers. And then if your reviewers are making changes, where are they making changes? Are they working directly in Contentful? How are those changes being stored? Where are they being stored? Who who is able to track the kinds of changes that are being made, the efficiencies that those changes introduce, how they impact the brand. So that just creates a significant loss in governance, which poses a huge obstacle towards scalability. When you think about this translation as a feature option, it's great. It's very simple to get started, but it gets incrementally more complex the more you iterate on that text. So that's one of the issues. The second issue is, and that's, let's say, the scalability problem. The second problem is the control problem. So when you're working with a large language model, let's say in this translation as a feature option, maybe you can control slightly the tone of voice, or maybe you can control some of the preferences or add reference materials, and that's great. But it's a very coarse level of control. When we think about language, right, sometimes we're making very detail-oriented changes. So maybe we're changing in a very specific context or in a very specific sentence. We're using something that's a little bit more slangy, a little bit more formal. Maybe we're using something that's a little bit more accessible. These changes, sometimes they are following overall rules, but sometimes they work as exceptions. How do you store those exceptions? How do you contextualize those exceptions? And when you're working with translation as a feature, what ends up happening is that you're going to have reviewers or people having to author text in each of these content management systems, which makes the internationalization process incredibly complex. If you're working with a translation management system like BureauWorks, you have the centralization option. So let's say maybe you could be working with Contentful and Zendesk and Marketo and Drupal and or GitHub, many other content management systems or repositories. All of that content is flowing into a single knowledge base. And you're managing a single knowledge base that's going to be carried over to every one of these repositories and content management systems. And that's super important, right? Because think about governance and how crazy that could be. When you think about control, right? Maybe you made this change in Contentful, but how do you make sure that that change gets replicated over in your intercom knowledge base? Or how do you make sure that that change gets carried over in marketing-facing collateral or videos, right? So when you think about language, you're always dealing with a language corpus. It's very, very tricky to slice and dice. It's like, imagine a company hiring one copywriter for their marketing website, but hiring a completely different copywriter for their email collateral and another copywriter for another piece of video. And sure, sometimes they do that, but typically to do that, they need a marketing department who's overseeing all of these different voices, all of these different ideas, and ensuring that each of these voices flows consistently with the overall brand messaging. When you think about translating and expanding this into so many different markets, each of these markets has also their subsequent voice, and it just becomes incrementally and exponentially more complicated to manage that. So translation as a feature, the summary, it's great. I love it. I mean, and honestly, I think in terms of enabling quick globalization initiatives from companies that are thinking about scaling, it's awesome. It's a great way to get started, right? But when you think about if your brand has a little bit more exposure, if your brand is a little bit more iconic, if your brand has more market presence in these countries, if it's protecting a certain consumer base, then these decisions become a lot more complicated, a lot more quickly. And if you don't have a software like BureauWorks, for instance, a translation management system that centralizes all of that and allows that very careful fine-tuning of that knowledge base that's generating the initial translations that are then being edited by people, possibly, or maybe that step could be skipped entirely, but it's still being seen by people, and changes are always being implemented because that's the nature of language. You're going to have a lot of problems managing that and scaling that if you're not working with software that's built for that. So that's the key thing that I have been most learning about large language models and generative AI so far, is that I love them. I think the applications, the possibilities that they open are incredible. I think that the speed to market, the cost to market, the way they can open different avenues, and the way they can allow humans to communicate differently to machines, I think all of that is incredible. I still don't think that downplays the significance of having the right software to manage that in the right way, right? It's kind of like, think about trying to perform a very complex surgery with a butcher knife as opposed with a scalpel. As good a doctor as you may find, they're going to have a hard time using a butcher knife as opposed to a scalpel. And it's super important, in my opinion, If anything, what's happening with large language models is the quality standards for content, for good content, is only going up, right? It's easier and easier and easier to produce AI slop. Never been easier. And people, in my opinion, most consumers are actually pretty smart. They don't want AI slop. They want messaging that resonates with them. They want things that are consistent with the brand. They want things that make them feel a part of that community. And in order to do that, you need the human touch, and not just slight touches here or there. You need ownership. And in order to have that ownership, you need the right software that makes that possible. So thanks so much for watching. Would love your comments below. Tell me what you think. Do you think translation as a feature is the end of a translation management system or just a new beginning? Till next time. Bye-bye.